Hi, this is Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Welcome to this week's episode of the SonicScoop podcast. And today's topic is mixing really that important? And the answer, spoiler alert, is a yes and no kind of thing. But I'm going to go into a bit of a rant mode today, a little bit of a stream of consciousness about my thoughts on mixing and why sometimes we over-prioritize mixing. But I also don't want to totally fool you into thinking that's not important at all. So I want to help you get a kind of balanced view on this thing. I will tell you this right out of the gate, that if I make a video episode podcast about mixing techniques, they tend to do better than the average. And it's not true of just this kind of pro audio music production channel. It's true across the board that people are really hungry for advice on mixing. People do a lot of searches on mixing. But here's the question. Why is it that we make mixing so incredibly important? And is it as incredibly important as people make it out to be? I have a couple of thoughts on why we put so much focus onto mixing, and I have a couple of thoughts about how you can stop yourself from focusing too much on mixing, because this is a problem for some people, is they get stuck, they get trapped at the mixing stage. And it's one of the things that stops their projects from ever feeling done. They do, mix final, then it's like mix final revision 1, and then it's like mix final revision 1 final. And this kind of thing often happens to people in the mixing process. We've talked about how people have trouble finishing and just moving on, and there's another podcast episode about that you can definitely check out. It's a good one, and there'll be some related themes in here. But I want to give you some ideas on how not to get stuck on mixing and how to make sure that mixing turns out really, really well for you. Okay, before we get into that, the briefest of shout outs for this week's sponsors, which includes Jay-Z. This microphone I'm talking to right now is a Jay-Z microphone. They just sent me this lovely new black hole microphone. I've actually been using a Jay-Z Amethyst on most episodes of the podcast up until now. And this one, the black hole, is just even more neutral, articulate, detailed. It's got a solid bottom end, but a really kind of clean top end, a tiny bit of a presence lift, but really gentle, kind of flat, detailed sounding microphone. Trying it out on the podcast today. Pretty natural, nice sounding mic. We are giving one of these away. You can get one for yourself, SonicScoop.com/contest. That's SonicScoop.com/contest. We're giving one of them away. Contest ends June 4th. And also sign up for the SonicScoop newsletter while you're there, because if these goes on sale in the future, we will let you know about it when that happens. Also, big shout out and thanks to Sound Toys, one of my favorite companies out there for creative mixing effects, which is what we're talking about today. So let's get into talking about mixing. Okay, here goes. Is mixing really that important? And why do we put such a focus of importance on it? Why is it where so many people get stuck? And I think here's the simple answer to that question. People, for the first time in their music production projects, really stop to think and evaluate when they get to the mixing stage, particularly when they're just starting out at this. And I've seen this happen again and again to so many people making their first albums, sometimes their second albums. But early on in any musician's career, when they're first getting into recording music, they kind of rush the whole process of pre-production, rush the process of recording, rush the process of overdubbing, because they have all these ideas that have been germinating in their heads. And now they just want to get them down, get them recorded real quick. Just get the whole recording thing done. And then they actually stop and start to reflect when it finally comes to the mixing stage. And they haven't built in stops along the way in many cases where they really listen to what they've been creating like it's any other record off the shelf and say, how does it sound compared to all other records off the shelf? And this is something that ideally you probably should bake into your process earlier on. It's one of the reasons I'm an advocate of pre-production for any artists where that's relevant, and that's particularly any musicians who use like actual instruments and aren't just creating things in the computer. We'll get to electronic music in just a moment. When it comes to that kind of music, having a pre-production step in the process where you've recorded everything real quick and gotten your ideas out real fast, and then you get to bake in a stop in the process where you sit there, listen to what you've created, and ask, is this good enough to release already? We recorded this in a quick and dirty way without paying obsessive amounts of attention to the way everything was tracked. Now let's say, is this good enough if we had recorded this for real, would we be excited to put it out there into the world? And that pre-production part of the process is often neglected. That's one of the natural places to stop and reflect. But also, in really good recording, the idea is to make it sound like a finished mix with every single instrument you add. And this is true whether you're recording the whole band at once or if you are doing overdubs. The idea shouldn't be, hey, let's get this stuff really recorded right now and then we'll adjust it and tweak it later in the mixing stage, and putting off decisions and putting off decisions and putting off decisions, so that when you finally get to the mixing stage where people stop for a minute, take a breath and say, okay, now it's time to evaluate all the stuff that we've captured. Like, if you do it that way, you're going to have worse results and you're going to have a lame time, compared to taking the care with each instrument you add to make sure, hey, when we added that guitar overdub, does that sound like the guitar part in a finished record? Because if it doesn't, let's change something right now. And when you offload decisions to later and later and later and later, that's when the mix becomes really important. And that's when fixing it in the mix becomes a thing. Now, I do want to offer some caveats here. There are some types of music in which the mix is super important. Like, the balances between things are super important. I'm going to bring up a 80s band I like to nerd out about, Tears for Fears. I have a special place in my heart for Tears for Fears. I didn't discover them until after I was into like grunge and metal and all that stuff growing up. And then later in life, I discovered Tears for Fears. I'm like, oh my goodness, this is amazing. But they're one of those bands where everything is really intricately produced, right? And the relationships between things and the way things are, for lack of a better word, mixed, is like an important part of the whole musical sculpture that you're engaging with. However, all of those mix decisions and production decisions didn't just happen at the mix stage. They happened to a significant degree in the recording stage and the pre-production stage. And there are some exceptions to this. A band that I interviewed, because I'm a big fan of them, another one, Stereolab. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Stereolab, but there's a tape-op interview I did with, I believe, two of the people from Stereolab. Did two different interviews. And this, again, is one of those bands where so much of it is about the instrumentation, the arrangement, the production, and to a degree, the mix and the mix relationship. And they are one of those artists, I will say, that kind of throws everything that I'm saying right now, I've said so far in this episode, away completely. Because their approach, and I thought this was interesting when I was interviewing them, Tim Gaines, main guy from there, they were telling me, you know, the way that we always did it is we would go into the studio and just record everything, record too much stuff, record, one part going throughout the entire song. And we didn't even know if we were going to use this part in the song at all, but we would just throw everything but the kitchen sink, into each of these recordings. And we'd be like, later we'll figure out how we're going to arrange this stuff. And they would literally just play all these parts through to the end or create loops and all of this stuff. And then later during the mixing stage, that's when they would do all of the production work. And that's okay. That's not wrong. But in a way, the mixing stage stops being post-production and it starts being part of production. And they really approached it in this kind of pastiche, collage-y way. It was the, beginning of the Pro Tools era where people were really starting to realize all of these crazy things you could do with looping. And, even when automated desks first came in, the idea of, muting and automating mutes and unmutes of certain elements coming in and out. And I guess that kind of started, you could argue, even earlier with kind of like dub music and, a form of reggae called dub, where, the studio was like a major instrument and the console was something that was being played and the mix was important. So I don't want to lie to you and tell you that there are no genres where mixing isn't important. But I only want to suggest that even in those genres where the mix is super duper duper important, you're still going to have the best results if every time you're recording a new element, you're thinking to yourself, does this sound like a finished element? Does this sound like something that would go on a finished final record? And I think for the majority of people who aren't working in genres like that, if you're playing any type of actual physical instrument, the best way to go about things is generally to put so many of the mix decisions into the process of arranging and recording. And in an ideal world, 90% of your mix decisions will happen during recording and arranging. And the mix, in an ideal world, almost becomes something of a formality. And the mixer is looking to just sweeten things. And having interviewed countless great mixers at the top of their game, I mean, some of the absolute greats, Manny Marroquin and Michael Brower and Mick Gazowski and John Congleton and Mark Needham. There's just so many of these names I could throw out to you who I've interviewed, again over the years. Tony Maserati, Chris Lord-Alge we've had on SonicScoop. In general, they're really looking for things to be somewhat pretty much finished by the time they get them. So they're really just making these kind of tweaks, and they're working on tone and character and final balances and the emotional arc of the track. And they're not really looking to fix things. Part of the reasons their mixes sound so great in so many of these cases is because they have great recordings and great productions to work from. Now, there are areas in which these kinds of things, the mix and the recording, blend together more and more. And this is especially true in electronic music production, hip-hop production, where naturally so many of the mix decisions are happening during the production. And a lot of people, when they start working in the box for the first time, people who are just digital natives who, the first thing they ever used was Pro Tools or Logic or Ableton, just go start throwing on plugins while they're tracking and making these mix decisions while they're tracking. And when this kind of digital way of working first started to come up, there were some old timers who were like, oh, you're mixing up the recording and the mixing process and you're doing it all wrong and you're not doing the thing with the bus and you're putting a reverb plugin on the vocal directly. And it's like, yeah, that's fine. That's actually great if every one of those moves you're making makes it sound more and more like a finished record. Do that. And to tell you the truth, if you go back and you look at the Motown or the Beatles in the 1960s, they were making the majority of their mix decisions while they were recording because they really had no other choice. You didn't have a gajillion tracks, right? So in a very significant way, that was the norm. And if you're doing everything wrong with your signal flow and you're putting on, reverb plugins as direct inserts, on instruments while you're in the recording process, and that's where you're getting part of your sound from, as long as it sounds good, keep doing it. And the reason I suggest templates to people for mixing is not because that stuff's wrong. It's just because I think if you're going to do this stuff again, you need a repeatable process that's really simple and gets the technology stuff out of the way. Not because it's wrong to have a haphazard approach. You can have a haphazard approach and make great sounding stuff. It's just the more you do this, the more that you start to develop systems, which is something we talked about in a recent podcast episode, to get good results fast and get the technology out of the way. So long story short, do we make mixing too important? In many ways, yes, probably. And a lot of the great mixers, if you watch some of the MixCon videos we've done, we do under the hood mix walkthroughs with great mixers. You listen to the Mick Gazowski one where he's mixing Jamiroquai, and it's before he mixes this Jamiroquai track, it sounds great, and then he mixes it, and it sounds even greater, But what are we adding in a good final mix to a really good production? Generally, 10%, 20%, maybe 30%. If you're adding 50% of the quality to the mix, there's a problem, major problems with the recording, or you're I don't know, we don't know what to do with our own art, you figure it out, and you're giving it someone else the license to, be the artist. Maybe that's a Martin Hannity approach to, Joy Division or New Order or something like that, where Martin Hannett, was he alive for New Order? Well, it's maybe a Martin Hannett approach where he's doing this crazy stuff with Joy Division or something. But that kind of stuff is the exception rather than the norm in major records that you love the sound of. And it's not wrong to do that. And it's not necessarily wrong to say, we made some stuff, we don't know if it sounds good, and let's have some freak mad scientist do a whole bunch of mixy stuff to it and give him creative license to do whatever and transform us. That approach of kind of remixing, of creating in the mix, it's fine and it can go right. It's just not going to be the norm in the majority of projects where the artist has a clear vision. They really want to express themselves, get their vision out there in conjunction with the producer, and then get it mixed. Usually that mixer should only be adding 10, 20, 30% at the most in the end. Another great example of this, another MixCon video you can check out is Jeff Ellis. Similar thing where when he's working on mixes these days, he's usually getting, and Manny Marroquin too, getting like full completed rough mixes, like the entire session with all their plugins on it that created the rough mix, and then fine tuning from there. And there are different ways to develop your own system. You can kind of bring down all the faders and then bring them back up to get your gain staging established that way. Or in the cases of, some people, they might start with all of the faders just up from the rough mix already there in the session and then go through their process on everything up, tweaking the things that they know need tweaking. And the same thing is going to happen with mastering. With the best masters I've done in many times, in many cases, are the ones where I did the least because the mix already sounds so great and I'm adding 10% or 15% to it. There are some really fun ones where I'm adding 20% and 30% to it and the client's blown away because they're like, how did you make this sound so good? Or there are certain ones where it's like, oh, that doesn't sound very good. And I add 50% and 60% and I have clients who are like, oh my God, that sounds amazing. Thank you for making our project sound awesome. We were worried this was never going to sound great. But the projects usually that people actually end up hearing more are the projects where everything sounds great every step of the way. And the mixer is maybe adding the final 20% and the mastering engineer is adding another 10% on top of that. Something along those lines. Those are often the best projects. That said, this is art stuff we're talking about. There's no rules. So if you want to do the opposite of everything I just said, you can. I just want to give you a balanced and realistic way of looking at what actually happens in the real world most of the time. So is mixing too important? Do we make it too important in our heads? Often, yes. It's often because we have not stopped to actually listen and reflect until we get to the mixing stage. But there's sometimes, you throw caution to the wind and you do art stuff in the mix and you just do crazy mixing and the production becomes about the mix. That happens too. But it's a small proportion of great releases that everyone remembers compared to the much bigger proportion where decisions are made early and great decisions are made every step of the way with constant times where we can have a point where we stop, reflect, and make decisions now and early instead of later. Hey, big thanks to you for hitting like and subscribe if you haven't already. This has been Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Big shout out to our sponsors. Remember, you can win one of these microphones. The Black Hole, we're giving one of them away at SonicScoop.com/contest. That's SonicScoop.com/contest. Or sign up for the newsletter at SonicScoop.com. You can find out when these go on sale in the future if they do. And also, if you haven't checked it out, I did a shootout with this microphone where I compare it to the JZ Amethyst and my old handy dandy Shure SM7B. That one just came out yesterday, so definitely check that out too on the SonicScoop YouTube channel. Also, a big thanks to Sound Toys, making some of my favorite creative mixing effects for when you do want to do a ton of crazy or interesting or subtle stuff in the mix. Definitely check out anything they make for free at soundtoys.com. Thanks for hanging out with me. This has been Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. See you next time. Hey, are you still here? Well, good thing, because I can't believe I just forgot to tell you about a free workshop you can sign up for, the 5 Habits of Truly Great Mixers. If you want to go even deeper on your mixing, go further and faster in your mixing, check out this free workshop. You can get SonicScoop.com/mixhabits. That's SonicScoop.com/mixhabits, where you will get the 5 habits of every great mixer. These are the common themes, the common threads, the common practices that I've found across the approach of all of the greatest mixers that I've studied, interviewed, talked with, seen work, all of that good stuff. So if you want to check that out, go to SonicScoop.com/mixhabits.